For the longest time, I've received emails and messages and requests from people asking, how do I learn about film? There's a million answers to this question, but most things we overthink when we should just be doing them. So welcome to Foundations of Film, what will hopefully be your complete comprehensive guide for film studies. Now let's get into it and start off simple. This is episode 1, and essentially all this is an assignment. I've arranged a watch list, and the aim is, obviously over a long period of time, to watch it. One of the best things you can do in the study of film is to go and study films. But where do you begin? What do you watch? Well, let's start here. This is a curated watch list of the 20th century of cinema. The reason I haven't included the 21st century is because those are films that people don't necessarily have trouble curating for themselves. This watch list isn't just a collection of the greatest films of all time, or even my personal favourites. The list attempts to expose anyone that goes through it to a fundamental but total experience of cinema. Some films that feature are pioneers for cinematic techniques. Some represent movements in independent cinema. Some will expose you to genre works, some are controversial, some you won't like. But this is the point. Because if I were to pick a collection of films to watch for the pure enjoyment of it, I'd just say go watch all the Kurosawa films and all the Hitchcock films. But to know cinema, you need to know its versatility. And if you want to learn about it, then throw yourself in the deep end and see all of what cinema has to offer. And I firmly believe that if all you do with this series of videos is go through this watch list, then you'll have a foundational reference to discuss any and every other film that you come across. You'll have an understanding of where techniques come from, of the changing story of cinema. You can approach this list however you choose, but the primary aim here is exposure to the medium of film. Now, if you are going to embark on this assignment, then there's one rule that must be applied from now until forever, and that is that you remove the 5 cardinal sins that stop people from watching films. They are as follows. The film is in a different language and subtitled. The film is old. The film is too slow. The film's too long. And the film doesn't really have a story. I don't think that any of these are good enough reasons not to show interest in a film, and the films in this watch list work at tackling these prejudices. There are foreign films, long films, slow films scattered throughout, and all of these barriers are to be completely discarded if you want to enhance your knowledge of cinema. Beyond that, go into the films and watch them with instinct. If you want to make notes on them, by all means. Find in them what you find. Don't worry about the details yet. Treat them as a piece of art. Let it speak to you. As you work your way through the films, you should start to contrast what you've already seen and begin to question things. Even if you believe you possess the most basic of knowledge, use it, focus on your reactions, and imagine yourself in charge of creating this piece. How do the filmmakers tell us what's happening? Where's the camera placed? What's it showing us? What's it hiding from us? Everything in the frame is both a decision that's been made and equally a decision that hasn't been made. Why in Do the Right Thing do some characters speak directly to the camera? In future episodes, we will add to further your reference so we know about cameras and editing and symbolism. But right now, go watch some films and have fun. In this video, I've compiled the watch list in chronological order so that we may view some kind of thread that ties all of cinema together. I've also offered a brief synopsis to every film so that those unfamiliar with the works can have a brief introduction to why each film is considered important or necessary for study. This series is designed so that it can benefit those completely new to film, as well as those with a more advanced knowledge of the medium. There will be something here for everyone. On our Patreon, we have a PDF of the films which acts as a checklist, as well as additional films related to the ones shown if you want more films to study. Thank you. This is Foundations of Film, the Film Studies Watchlist. Where cinema began is a contestable thing in and of itself, as to when moving pictures officially shifted into the medium of film as we know it is often one of semantics. There's no hardline moment, and the idea of what the first movie was is in many ways up for debate, depending on your definition of a movie. Which is why early cinema is a discipline in and of itself, and an area of study that could be almost insular and separate to the whole of cinema in many regards. However, if you do want a specific starting off point for cinema, then start with Fred Ott's Sneeze. This was directed by William Dixon and was one of the many films created at the Edison Lab. It's technically the 19th century that we begin. However, this is as universally accepted a point that the work of the Edison Labs were in fact films. They were thought of as one-shot movies, as they're all comprised of a single shot from a single perspective. Almost all of them are less than 30 seconds long, but they offer the first glimpse into the perspective of film as an almost magical feat. It was here that the most primitive forms of visual communication and entertainment became portals to new worlds. The obvious parallel with Edison's work came in Europe with the Lumiere brothers. However, whereas Edison was shooting inside a studio, the Lumiere cinematograph was a much more lightweight machine, and thus they were able to shoot outdoors. Countless films from the 1890s throughout the early 1900s were developed as methods to first explore what could be captured on film. Soon, they were experimenting with cutting and experimenting with the first brand of special effects. Right from the get-go, cinema was already finding evolutions in its technological developments. From here, early cinema has a plethora of developments with almost every single release, too many to point out. However, we will pick a select few that signified a distinct shift or important development technologically or conceptually. The Big Swallow by James Williamson. James Williamson was one of the most creative pioneers of early cinema, and his piece The Big Swallow shows an awareness of the camera which had not yet been put into practice. It begins with a man speaking, and the camera moves closer and closer to his mouth until he's swallowed entirely, camera included. Which meant that to convince the audience the camera had been swallowed, there needed to be a secondary camera that was filmed. Though simple now, this was a groundbreaking perspective in 1901. When we think of subversive elements in which people may break the fourth wall or offer meta-commentaries on cinema, it was in the beginning of the 20th century that these thoughts had already been established by incredibly inventive artists such as James Williamson. And this film shows us the developments between the camera as both a visible and invisible tool that a filmmaker must navigate the audience's perception of. Voyage dans la Lune by Georges Méliès. Perhaps one of the most famous images in all of cinema is a beaming lunar face with a rocket poked in its eye. There's an idealized notion of the magic of cinema, and I can't help but feel that this idea emerged with the work of Georges Méliès, particularly his most famous piece, Trip to the Moon. As a working magician, Méliès was fascinated with the possibilities of film and its trickery. His work is often defined as theatrical. However, I believe performative is the more appropriate term because Méliès's methodology was no different to his magic tricks. The medium of film was simply a device to manipulate, to deceive and amaze his audience. Using colour, cutting, double exposure and a plethora of techniques that he was developing on the fly, Méliès was advancing the work of special effects through his innovations with the camera. Méliès's work will always remain a testament to the ingenuity of filmmaking techniques and that the limits of cinema are only limited by one's own imagination. The Great Train Robbery by Edwin S. Porter. Many have expressed that plot and cinematic narrative emerge with this film. However, this is not true. Some have stated that this is the first film to cut away to another location. This is also not true. What The Great Train Robbery is a culmination of the techniques formed in early cinema, a benchmark that by 1903, narrative had sufficiently developed that the framework of the modern form of cinematic storytelling had become visible. In The Great Train Robbery, Edwin S. Porter establishes that cutting away from an action to a brand new location no longer needed grand exposition on behalf of the audience. The quick development in image literacy meant that filmmakers could move between locations and the audience would be able to infer that the lines of narrative were occurring parallel to one another. The Great Train Robbery is an example of how quickly audience understanding of cinema was evolving. Phantasmagoria by Emile Cole. And even as these rapid developments and discoveries were occurring with live-action cinema, cinema as a whole was still experimenting with where the limitations were in the form itself. As we've established a beginning point with live-action cinema, so we should with animation, and Phantasmagoria is widely considered the first animated cartoon. We have to admire the tenacity that around 10 years after the emergence of cinema, some lone artist was deciding to create something that a few years ago would have been utterly impossible, only for it to come to fruition in a short period of time. This is the joy of early cinema. The lack of rules meant that anything could be created and become the new standard. Suspense by Lois Weber. Exactly as the title suggests, suspense is an exercise that results in a remarkable foray into the world of a sophisticated thriller piece. While a phone call is occurring, a man is trying to break into a house. While he's trying to break in, the husband is driving to that very house. Although not the first instance of split screen occurring in film, its usage was one that highlighted the impact of multiple scenes occurring at the same time. Everything you can learn about the importance of pacing, crescendos of tension, and what the audience knows that the characters don't, at its fundamental level, is explored in this film, a primary tool for cinematic study. The Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith. And it's better to get it out of the way sooner rather than later, what is undoubtedly the most controversial film on this list, and probably the most abjectly reviled film of all time, yet one that if we must concede, we have to return to. Can anybody enjoy this film? Probably not, because it's impossible to bypass its racial, well, you can't call them undertones because it's just the film. The Birth of a Nation is about the KKK, and the film's success is regarded as the primary reason for the group's resurgence back in the 1910s. It was the first motion picture to be screened inside the White House, and it's forever tied to the history of mankind's racial prejudice. This can't be ignored. However, what also can't be ignored is the film's impact on cinema. Without The Birth of a Nation, the trajectory of film is completely altered. Now there are many instances of people attempting to downplay the importance of The Birth of a Nation, and this simply isn't true. Whether we want it to be or not, The Birth of a Nation became the prototype for the modern feature film. It was not the first, and as we've seen, many films have been wrongly attributed for being the first to establish a technique. But what The Birth of a Nation did do was take Griffith's career of incredible ingenuity in film language and gave it the means to reach its zenith. Parallel sequences, tracking shots, conscious framing. It was all here and on a scale no one had seen before. The techniques pioneered by this film were so impactful that we're still talking about them to this day despite the film's content. At its release, The Birth of a Nation was the greatest feat in cinema, bar none. It's unfortunate, but it's true. But with this comes a lesson that we have to understand and respect the power that images possess. And if the artist has a command over his images in the way that someone like Griffith had, then you have the ability to create a film that can mould the world through your lens. Intolerance by D.W. Griffith. The irony that followed The Birth of a Nation comes with Griffith's response to the film, as he was surprisingly upset at some critics' response that he was perpetuating intolerant views. Griffith thought that they were the intolerant ones, and so he made Intolerance, which is actually the better film of the two. Intolerance is the more experimental, even larger in scale epic to The Birth of a Nation. Set over the history of humanity in 4 separate tableaus, the narrative follows completely separate stories as they all become tied thematically by the theme of intolerance and tied imagetically by eternal motherhood rocking her cradle. Each story was distinguished by its own colour tint, and it was known for boundary-pushing set design and narrative style. It's a genuine epic, one that perhaps could only find more nuanced appreciation beside the bombastic style of The Birth of a Nation. Intolerance is a legitimately avant-garde film, and one that exposes in cinema the absolute necessity of grand ambitions. J'accuse by Abel Gance. There was still much development in film techniques that would occur in the years to follow. However, the work of Abel Gance always seemed so innovative compared to anything else that was occurring at the time. From the title sequence, naming his cameras as the people operating them, to spelling out the film with his actors, there was absolutely no limit to his creativity. His work is so romanticised that the very act of filmmaking is elevated to a transcendental light through his lens. If you want to expand your mind with the knowledge of what you can do with composition and colour and ideas, then begin with a film like J'accuse. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari by Robert Vine. German Expressionism arrived alongside the collective exposure to human darkness made visible after the First World War, and in order for art to display this newfound darkness, it had to undergo a physical shift. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is the poster child for German Expressionism reaching cinema. With its elongated shadows and hyper-stylized geometry, a new style would be injected throughout world cinema, beginning with this film. With this film, cinema was ready to fully embrace Expressionism in the coming decade, and Caligari was able to legitimize cinema's intellectual foundations and aesthetic versatility. The hyper-stylization through cinematic genres was ready to finally commence, and this can be witnessed by the plethora of German Expressionist work that followed. The Phantom Carriage by Victor Sjöström. Not only a pioneer for horror cinema, but the style of Sjöström's The Phantom Carriage is felt to this day. Carrying much of the similarities of German Expressionism, but with its own defined style, Sjöström masterfully used double exposure to create these spectral, translucent figures that place viewers in a completely supernatural world. The film, on top of furthering the world of special effects, also incorporated complex flashbacks within flashbacks to create a narrative loop that was incredibly layered, especially for the time. Its gothic tones blur horror with morality, and the ghost-like aesthetic of its shooting style is still influential to this day. Haxan by Benjamin Christensen. It's amazing to consider how forward-thinking Haxan was upon its release. Not only is it one of the most visually astounding films ever made, it's almost indefinable. It's a horror, yet at the same time part documentary, part essay film exploring a history of witchcraft. Seeing the creativity on display in these unsettling compositions and an imagery that's actually unnerving, it is silent cinema at its best, dispersing genuinely subversive visuals with the creativity expected from one of cinema's pioneers. Sherlock Jr. by Buster Keaton. I'm obviously going to recommend the remainder of Buster Keaton's work here, as he's not only the absolute peak for comedy as a cinematic tool, but his understanding of the medium as a whole stands alongside any of cinema's early pioneers. Buster Keaton is the quintessential funny man. You can watch all of his work for the pure entertainment of it, but at the same time, you'll still be asking yourself, exactly how did he do that? Sherlock Jr. is a spectacle on all accounts, one where we see the willingness that a human being is daring to put themselves through for their craft, and another where we see the apparent endless imagination when it comes to cinema of Keaton himself. Greed by Erich von Stroheim. Sadly, a film which none of us will see the entirety of, as the full version has been lost to time. Much like Suspense, this film is indicative of its title, thematically crafting a tale of human avarice following a married couple who, after winning the lottery, become slowly corrupted by their newfound success. The film uses gold tinting as a framing device to show how greed begins to corrupt and overwhelm the image entirely. Although we will never have the full version, what remains is still an incredible critique of materialism and an intense depiction of moral decay through cinematic techniques. The Last Laugh by F.W. Murnau. An almost companion piece to Greed, The Last Laugh follows a hotel doorman who, in the almost obsessive strive to maintain his dignity and pride, befalls a series of misfortunes. As the character becomes warped in this haze, unable to form foundations in the status-obsessed society, the camera follows suit and becomes completely free. It moves and sways in manners that by 1924 standards, I've never seen anywhere else. Up to its release, The Last Laugh, as far as I can tell, was the largest individual development for the use of the handheld camera. If there are films that you can point to and say that was a shifting point because we can see it, then The Last Laugh is definitely one of those films. Battleship Potemkin by Sergei Eisenstein. If you've ever engaged in film studies, then you've already come across this film, as this is for many the starting point of active cinematic learning, though it is for good reason. Again, although the film is quite literally nothing more than propaganda for the USSR, we must return to it to understand the developments of cinema. The singular most important aspect of Battleship Potemkin comes in its editing, or as it was known from this point on, Soviet montage theory. Battleship Potemkin was the first film to popularise the theory put forth by the Soviet Film School. The idea being that editing is more than just constructing a film. You're taking individual pieces of film and putting them together, or more so, you're placing them alongside one another. In essence, the construction of any film is an intellectual process, meaning that it's a form of linguistics, like symbols. Symbols have connotations within themselves. Similarly, an individual piece of film means something within itself. However, when it's placed next to another piece of film, then a new meaning emerges on the interplay of the two. You can place that same piece of film next to an infinite different pieces of film and change its perception based on its context. This is also known as the Kuleshov effect, and it's still something that many editors will keep in mind when constructing footage. But Battleship Potemkin was the first film to consciously employ the ideas that were being developed in the Soviet Film School. And when broken down bit by bit, we can see its ideas on show. It's a completely intellectual form of cinema, but it's an effective one nonetheless. And any other films from the Soviet Union of this period will also be beneficial watches to understand the theory on a deeper level. A Page of Madness by Teinosuke Kinosaga. Expanding upon German Expressionism after the likes of Caligari, A Page of Madness is another form of Expressionism which is often less spoken of in the realm of cinematic study. Set in an asylum, a man seeks to save his wife who's being committed, and the film is a raw study of psychological turmoil. The film rejects any kind of linear narrative and rather takes us on a journey of regret, insanity, and the fracturing of one's own psyche by eschewing cinematic continuity in favour of a kind of cinematic torment. Images here frighten because they're not tied down by any foundation. Metropolis by Fritz Lang. The 1920s seemed to be the era wherein genre was the most prevalent in cinema, yet humanism seemed to often be at the core of all its tropes. Metropolis is no different. A science fiction epic, Metropolis explores the dual nature between humanity's striving for mechanical opulence being at conflict with humanity's soul. The set design is immaculate. The scale and ability of what these artists were able to achieve is still mesmerizing to this day. It's a visually stunning epic and it works on every level a film is supposed to. It's essential watching for anyone. Napoleon by Abel Gance. For me, this is the most creative film ever made. Again, although there is a parallel with Greed in that we still don't have the entire cut of Napoleon, it matters less here because we do have the majority of it. But to even begin to explain this film is to do it a disservice, because simply experiencing this film is all you need for it to communicate with you everything that it wants to. I've already mentioned how Abel Gance seems so much further ahead than his contemporaries, but this is undoubtedly his magnum opus. There are sequences and techniques in this film that I haven't seen replicated to this day, and if I hadn't seen this film and saw these techniques for the first time, I would still think they were brilliantly innovative. Napoleon was made with Abel Gance's belief that cinema was a form of artistic communication that could celebrate humanity and even elevate it through its creation. And if Napoleon was his thesis for this, then he wouldn't be wrong. This is cinema positioning itself as the highest art form. Sunrise, A Song of Two Humans by F.W. Murnau. A simple story of the act of being in love is demonstrated with such delicacy in this film. The film puts forth the idea that love can conquer anything, and bravely does so by following a husband's redemption after plotting to kill his wife. What follows is the poetry of being in love and the joy that exudes from that. The film calls itself a song because it serves as an ode to humanity, expressing all of the emotions that one feels in the simple act of living, and all of that joy is translated through the romantic lens of its cinematic language. The Passion of Joan of Arc by Carl Theodor Dreyer. René Falconetti's mournful expression is maybe the most famous face in all of cinema, even for those that haven't seen the film. Because if there was one thing that The Passion of Joan of Arc expressed, it was the power of the face. Telling the story almost entirely through close-ups, Dreyer creates an intimate yet claustrophobic exploration of his character's suffering. Her judges are uncompromisingly aggressive, whereas she, with her votive eyes, shows a deep spiritual resilience. The film possesses a space because Joan's inward world is the focus, even though we never escape the confines of these barren, soulless walls. Any excess in this film is stripped away, and what we're left with is a vision of film which leaves the human soul exposed for all to see. It's a harrowing portrayal of the power of the camera and the importance of human fragility for a character as strong as this. Dreyer knew that cinema could be minimized, and that perhaps that was cinema at its purest and most powerful. Un Chant Andalou by Louis Buñuel. Pairing up with Salvador Dalí, all logic is disposed of, as the unconscious, the repressed, and everything you do not understand takes precedence in Un Chant Andalou. With imagery fueled purely by the subconscious, this is a film not to be explained, but it's necessary to exist, so it may open up the avenues of unconventional storytelling. Man with a Movie Camera by Dziga Vertov. The climax of the Soviet montage came in the form of Man with a Movie Camera, a genreless examination into mechanization, workers, and the voyeurism of cinema. Man with a Movie Camera will remain in the annals of cinema as the most well-edited film of all time. The pace at which this film moves, its constantly shifting ideas, the imagetic comparisons and matches across its runtime make it a vibrant collage of endlessly moving parts. The film is a snapshot of life in the roaring 20s, told exclusively through the moving image and nothing more. But the purpose of the film was to send viewers into an almost subconscious manner of reading said images, where the eye could pick up on things that the human body could not. In many ways, to evolve our mode of thinking through the use of images. Man with a Movie Camera can be seen as a form of video essay, a self-reflexive exploration on the role of cinema and of the filmmaker, whose eye dictates exactly what we see and exactly how we see it. M by Fritz Lang. A landmark in sound cinema. Although the first feature to use sound goes to the jazz singer, M would be the first to sophisticate it as integral to the cinematic experience. The hunt for a child murderer is almost entirely told through sound. The motif of the killer's whistle, the amplified tension of ensuing predators growing louder and louder. Every piece of the mise-en-scène here is a psychological tool. The inner world is on display, with much of this inspiration coming from Fritz Lang's endeavours in German Expressionism. However, its transition to use these same techniques for suspense and tension would be instrumental for thrillers and the incoming film noir genre for years to come. Freaks by Todd Browning. Although he was the man who brought Dracula to the screen, it's a testament to the power of Freaks that this is Browning's more remembered piece. Challenging cinema's idealization of beauty, Freaks is an unsensationalized portrayal of the most marginalized in society. The film's cast of circus performers were made up of people that were, up to this point, sideshows in real-life circus acts. Debate has raged over the years of this film as it was notoriously banned in many countries. However, the message of the film is to challenge our preconceived notions of otherness and how naturalism in shooting can evoke sympathy for those we do not understand and sometimes outright reject. The Testament of Dr. Mabuse by Fritz Lang. A cornerstone for thrillers, Dr. Mabuse is another of Lang's masterpieces that excel in cinematic tension. Through all of the mise-en-scène, Lang crafts a stunningly powerful depiction of a mad genius with the capacity to manipulate all around him to commit evil. Not only is it a fantastic watch and a deeply effective villain, but it's also profoundly deep in its understanding of psychology in cinema. Duck Soup by Leo McCarey. I mentioned that the film is directed by Leo McCarey, although I should really clarify that this is a Marx Brothers film. The Marx Brothers got their start on radio shows, and many of the jokes in Duck Soup were lifted directly from a radio show that the brothers were already working on. So why is this film on the list? Because it's the archetype for the comedy genre within cinema. The brothers embraced absurdism in this quasi-political satire. However, for every real-world satirization we can find, we're ultimately watching cinema as a tool for comedy and nothing more. The fourth wall breaking close-ups by the brothers are never not funny, and I'd wager that this film has the highest ratio of great one-liners per minute. The film is completely anarchic in its aims to get a laugh, but they all work. Groucho Marx was born to be the snarky, witty joke machine, and Chico and Harpo are like a genius double act in themselves. I used to watch all the Marx Brothers films as a boy when my father introduced them to me. They were funny then, and they're still funny now. L'Atalante by Jean Vigo. Jean Vigo remains an almost mythical figure within cinema, with L'Atalante being his only feature before his untimely death at the age of 29. The film is poetic realism, and even if you could only see the images of the film, you'd still be able to tell that what Vigo did here with the art of cinematography is nothing short of groundbreaking. The fluidity of the camera, moving underwater, in and out of dreams, and it does it all with such ease. As beautifully as it captures the realist setting of Paris in the presence of two newlyweds, what's more magnificent is how it's able to transform and transcend the environment into this ethereal landscape. The eye of Vigo had such a strong vision for how cinematic techniques could be evolved into some form of magic. Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. Modern Times is not the only seminal Chaplin film of this era. However, it is an example of how, in the now popularized era of sound, Chaplin still chose to prioritize image, using slapstick techniques of what was becoming more of a bygone era, but how they were still relevant even in this incoming world that spoke of dehumanizing effects of industrialization. It's a masterclass in comedic imagery and satire, and an example of what works universally always will. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs by the Walt Disney Company. We mentioned Phantasmagoria as the first animation being a triumph of creativity, but now I want you to imagine this. The Walt Disney Company has become a staple of animation by the mid-1930s, most notably for their Silly Symphony shorts. They had the greatest animators in the world and had pushed the quality and perception of animation forward more than anyone else had. However, there was yet to exist an animated feature film from anyone. People thought it to be impossible, even within Disney itself. The manpower and effort to create a feature of such magnitude would be the equivalent of making 20 Silly Symphonies cartoons for a single project. In order to bring it to fruition, the head animators held private animation classes together, where they would learn how to realistically animate the human form in a variety of poses. They learn about anatomy, as well as expressive character design, and how they could feasibly create this over a feature length. And to have an idea of how alien a concept this was, Executives naturally assumed that this was going to completely ruin Disney. No audience could be captivated by a cartoon for this long. It was only because Walt Disney himself convinced his team that this wasn't to be a comedy, as all animation was up to that point. It had to have tragedy. It had to be treated as a serious film. Even in its art direction, we see the influences of the German expressionist films of earlier. I mention all of this because when we think of ingenuity, we often have to compare an artist with their contemporaries. And when it comes to what could have influenced Disney to create this project, there was nothing else like it. Snow White truly is a visionary piece of work, and it broke the barrier of what an animation could be. The reason that we have the work of Satoshi Kon, Pixar, Studio Ghibli begins with Walt Disney's Snow White. Stagecoach by John Ford. With this film, the Western genre became legitimized as a serious cinematic art form. Moving away from the serialized adventures, the storytelling was no longer about nameless archetypes shooting one another. Now it was character-driven, rich characters navigating the vast splendor of the West, and all the while these lyrical landscapes are interspersed with dynamic action sequences where the editing and cinematography are able to truly choreograph the action into something vigorous and powerful. It's the first, though not the last, John Ford masterpiece. The Rules of the Game by Jean Renoir. Rules of the Game is a somewhat farcical comedy in that elegant French manner, in that it mixes equal measures of sophistication with decadence. Set on a weekend retreat at a chateau, a cavalcade of characters convene on the eve of the Second World War, and we watch the interplay of their moral callousness and foolishness. And while all of this chaos ensues, you as a viewer begin to wonder how a film which boasts such anarchy has the ability to float like a feather. The film doesn't really have a central character for us to hone in on, and so we move back and forth between everyone at the chateau. What was in the foreground becomes background. A theatre performance from the seat of the audience is shown a new perspective on stage. Fights occur through corridors which we hear as we follow a new conversation. We're thrown all around these hierarchies and mini-narratives, but we never feel lost. Renoir knows exactly where we should go next, and he gently carries us there. We explore the absurdity of most human interactions in a way wherein Renoir conducts us with a completely natural flow. This is a film of balance of techniques and a masterclass in pacing and controlling the atmosphere of one's work. Gone with the Wind by Victor Fleming. What was the biggest release in cinema up to that point, Gone with the Wind, if anything, should be remembered as a testament to the success of the studio systems. Though it should never be seen as the only way to make films, when the structure is in place and worked to its utmost, then we get works like Gone with the Wind. What is there to say? They got the greatest cinematographer, the world's biggest actor, the world's biggest film composer, and the largest budget in the studio's history to create the grandest epic that cinema had seen. Everything about Gone with the Wind is romanticized, a romantic depiction of the American South with elaborate costumes, intense expressionistic lighting, and a sweeping score. We watch in all its opulence and decay the story of one of cinema's richest characters in Scarlett O'Hara, with all her resilience, petulance, and tragedy. It's a technicolor marvel and an example of what the medium of cinema can achieve when treated as something transcendental, even in its studio forms. And if this is what the large studios were still making, then who could protest? The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin. Entering the Second World War saw Charlie Chaplin adopt his first truly spoken role. At a time when perhaps people needed to hear the voice of dissent to the chaos that had engulfed the world, Chaplin closes his film with one of the most sincere monologues of a heartfelt plea to humanity. The humanism throughout The Great Dictator is poignant, however it still operates firstly as a satire, with perhaps the greatest rendition of a pseudo-Mussolini character. It's again Chaplin doing what he does best, which is comedic symbolism with the human heart at the forefront of it all. Funny, daring, and delicate. Fantasia by the Walt Disney Company. Whereas Snow White opened the doors for what animation would become, Fantasia set its potentiality into stratospheric proportions. What was considered a new form of entertainment, the blending of classical music and the groundbreaking animation, Fantasia was a synchronicity between two mediums at their apex. With no dialogue, Fantasia sought to bring spectacle and craftsmanship to the forefront of the film, and the result is a spectacular triumph. The original plan was for Fantasia to become a yearly release, but the level of production simply couldn't bring it to fruition. Again, much like Snow White, Fantasia must be held in high acclaim for the ambition of its artistry. Originally, the film toured around the United States as a roadshow, and I always think that decades prior to now, in the earlier period of cinema, there was still opportunity to completely redefine what cinema could be. Why not have every project with its own language, with its own form of distribution? Why not attempt to commune to the audience in completely new fashions? Fantasia is all of that. It's the pinnacle of creativity in an experiment to find new avenues for the arts, and somehow it succeeds. Citizen Kane by Orson Welles. The most important film of all time? Perhaps. Definitely the most influential. Probably the one that's most often regarded as the best film of all time. And with such a reputation, it would have to be required watching regardless of how it stood today. Yet the fact of the matter is that everything you could learn about the technicalities of cinema is all here in this film. It's not an exaggeration that this is the film that altered cinematic language because every technique you could envision was either perfected or created here. Cinematographer Greg Toland's use of deep focus, strong lighting made every composition something new. Your eyes became guided in unique ways that opened up the cinematic frame like never before. What would have once been empty space was now filled with a plethora of information that not only makes the film a visual feast, but externalizes the complexity of its main character, Charles Foster Kane. Even in the department of cinematic structure, a mystery told through flashbacks, through memory, differing perspectives, unreliable narrators. The camera moves into windows. Two shots invoke both extreme close-ups and wide angles. It really is a complete film, and you can't downplay its impact for its technical prowess. But it also just happens to be a fantastic piece of art and one of the best character studies in cinema. I've mentioned before that the biggest tragedy comes not with Citizen Kane being regarded as the greatest film of all time, but that Welles' sequel, The Magnificent Ambersons, probably would have been, if not cut and butchered by the studio without his permission. So, as another watch on top of Citizen Kane, his unfinished masterpiece, The Magnificent Ambersons, should also be watched. To Be or Not to Be by Ernst Lubitsch. In my opinion, the greatest comedy of all time. If The Great Dictator was a plea for humanity, then To Be or Not to Be is a stroke of genius in the emergence of comedy through suffering. We have to recall just how dangerous it was to release a comedy in this vein in 1942. We live in a world of great conflict, but can you imagine a mainstream release coming out making a joke about the suffering that currently goes on in the world? Now extrapolate that information and apply it to the most devastating war in the history of mankind, where legitimate threat was all over the globe, and then start to make jokes about it. This is the milieu that created To Be or Not to Be. But the fact of the matter is that even without the historical context of being what was at the time the most controversial mode of comedy, To Be or Not to Be is hilarious, brilliantly written, and a masterclass in dark comedy. While the film is comedic through and through, it's equally a razor-sharp thriller, with its constant duplicitous characters dealing with espionage, playing roles, double-crossing, the likes of which would be expected from a Hitchcock film. There's an idea of the Lubitsch touch as an immaterial cinematic technique that Ernst Lubitsch perfected. a kind of dry misdirection and innuendo that permeates all his work. And if To Be or Not to Be is any kind of benchmark for it, then there isn't a better way to deliver comedy in cinema. Meshes of the Afternoon by Maya Deren. How a short, surrealist, experimental piece became as necessary today may seem almost inconceivable. However, that is until you watch Meshes of the Afternoon and realise that its imagery will be imprinted on you forever. Maya Deren was a dancer, and with this came an unparalleled understanding of space and form, using not only the contortions of the physical body, but blending it with the contorting of perspectives, camera angles, and motion deliver a mysterious tale of identity and fear. The constant repetition of the narrative puts you in an almost dreamlike state, and it truly instigated a new form of language for all experimental film to follow. It's the most impactful short film since Un Chien Andalou. Casablanca by Michael Curtiz. If you want to learn about the foundations of a good screenplay, then just watch Casablanca. From the introduction of its main character, to establishing the world in which the film takes place, everything is exactly where it should be. The setting of Rick's bar is a transitory location wherein the eclectic characters convene as a kind of resting point before they depart on their personal journeys. There's a neutrality about the space, that everyone there, as different and as vivacious as most characters are, must obey its rules until they can leave. Humphrey Bogart is Rick, and he's the man in charge until that equilibrium is shattered, when a long-lost love from the past walks through its doors one more time. It's a perfect story, but it's the storytelling that shines. Pacing, character, how everything develops precisely as it should. There's no great secret in Casablanca, other than it crafts a great screenplay, but executes it perfectly. Double Indemnity by Billy Wilder. By the 1940s, the world was entrenched in the trauma of World War II, and its art had thoroughly portrayed this. Cinema had moved away from its pleasantries of the 1930s and was now fully invested in film noir, a genre which evoked the darkness of the human spirit in shadowy figures colluding with femme fatales. There's an entire encyclopedia about the iconography of film noir. However, if we are to learn about what it is at its most fundamental level, then we go straight to Double Indemnity. Following an insurance salesman becoming implicated in a murder by the sultry Barbara Stanwyck, Double Indemnity tells a story from the perspective of the morally dubious, of a twisted relationship mirroring the moral decay of the time. Evolving from German Expressionism, the stark lighting was similar, however this time it was diegetic rather than expressionistic. Harsh lines of light are made by the Venetian blinds of an office, displaying the duality of man's spirit. Film noir set the benchmark for a new brand of cinema that was to be involved with tragic endings, where antagonists are victorious. With Double Indemnity, the foundation was set for a new kind of fatalistic cinema. Ivan the Terrible by Sergei Eisenstein. This two-part epic acts as a textbook for how to tell a story through composition. With its use of shadows, Ivan almost tells itself through silhouettes, every image like a symbol conversing with itself through a rich tapestry of history. Incredibly expressionistic, and sadly also an unfinished trilogy due to censorship from Stalin himself. It would have been a tragedy to lose a film this imagetically rich. Beauty and the Beast by Jean Cocteau. The beginning of The Beauty and the Beast opens with a request to the audience that they approach the ensuing film with the same imagination and openness of a child, and it's understandable as to why Cocteau wanted this of his audience. The film is a fairy tale and makes no concessions about its artifice, using slow motion, reverse motion, and transporting us into Beast's castle full of otherworldly set design that he does not want us to watch it as we would any other film. It's to remove our sensibilities towards any kind of realism and embrace the utterly romantic, the completely fantastical, to be a part of its ambience. This is a film that celebrates the tenacity of any film that has the ability to create its own rules however it sees fit. It's a work of art of complete fantasy, and it's all the more beautiful for it. Paisan by Roberto Rossellini. The world that emerged after the war was a fragmented one, and nothing displayed that better than Paisan by Rossellini, who creates 6 vignettes of completely separate stories set in a post-war Italy. The film is 6 short films, and it's all shot in a manner of what was available in a war-torn Rome. Real locations with non-professional actors, a documentary style of cinematography, with each vignette reflecting a unique aspect of the human condition amidst this turmoil. Paisan, I believe, is the most successful of Rossellini's war trilogy, as it's also the most experimental and unique. However, both Rome Open City and Germany Year Zero are also essential watches. Brief Encounter by David Lean. I made a while back a list of what I considered the 30 greatest films. If I were to make the list again, there would inevitably be some changes, as there always is with lists so definitive. But one of those would most likely be the inclusion of Brief Encounter, an incredibly understated and restrained film about a tale of forbidden love. David Lean films their rendezvous with such intimacy, always filmed close together, to only then display the empty streets, always reminding us of the melancholy that surrounds our protagonists. Every scene carries such intense emotional weight, including what may be the most beautiful final scene in all of cinema. The Bicycle Thieves by Vittorio De Sica. Much like Rossellini's war trilogy, post-war Italian cinema bore a style which was later known as Italian neorealism. Its focus was on simple human stories, as they were what was most important to the world at that point, and nothing emphasises this more than The Bicycle Thieves. A story of a man hoping to provide for his family, gets his bicycle stolen one day, and goes on the look for it with his son. There's an emotional depth and desperation through a story that's so restrained. There's no great drama throughout most of the film. Though the consequences are dire, we know that life must continue regardless, and The Bicycle Thieves is an example of the human spirit undergoing countless hardships, which on their surface seem so inconsequential. It's a story that shows that any form of storytelling can take shape under any circumstances, but the universality that comes with the human condition remains its most integral part. Italian neorealism is the foundation for all realist films to follow, stripping away all of the excess that cinema can place on a film to leave us with the simplest of stories. Children of the Beehive by Hiroshi Shimizu. In a similar vein to The Bicycle Thieves, Children of the Beehive is a more Japanese styling of neorealism, about a group of orphans from the war who create a makeshift family with a soldier. The film is likewise observational and never intrudes on the young boy's resilience, whereas the Italian neorealist movement focused more on the hardships mankind was facing. Children of the Beehive brings a sense of hope amidst the same adversity. The Red Shoes by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger. What Powell and Pressburger did for cinema is a form of magic. Technicolor had existed for many years by this point, and many musicals and large Hollywood productions were utilising it as a kind of spectacle in itself. But few could use it as an emotional tour de force like Powell and Pressburger could. The Red Shoes follows a ballet, and the film itself serves as half film, half theatre performance, with large dreamlike sets, almost psychedelic sequences of colour and motion, beautiful dancing, all of which blur together, exposing our main character's descent into obsession. The apex of all these techniques come in the ballet performance within the film, which is a cinematic marvel like no other. This film is the definition of colour, of a maximalist style of cinema which permeated the entirety of the duo's filmography. The Third Man by Carol Reed. Who could have thought that a city could be shot like this? Set in war-torn Vienna, never has a city become so ingrained in the story of a film like it did in The Third Man, popularising the famous Dutch angles, with deep black shadows creating a labyrinthian maze which disorientates the viewer and mirrors the confusion of our protagonist. It's a quintessential noir film, but also one that crafted its own unique language. I love this film, and I still think it's amazing how brazenly unique it was for the time and to this day. The brilliant finale in the sewers displays such a keen understanding of space as well as tension. Some of these films I could speak about all day, because they're just so rich in how much they offer through their cinematic language, and The Third Man is one of those films. It really stands alone in its own realm of innovation in regards to cinematic language. Sunset Boulevard by Billy Wilder. Although I mentioned that Casablanca is the perfect screenplay, Sunset Boulevard was the film that made me take notice of the screenplay as an art form in itself. The film opens with the voiceover of its main character, who is dead, and follows a story of an evolving Hollywood and the debauchery that lies beneath its shining lights. Not only a thrilling noir story, it's also a meta-commentary on the shifting shape of Hollywood moving from the old world into the new. How the stars of yesteryear turn into ancient relics, disregarded by time, with Gloria Swanson delivering perhaps the greatest performance from any actress in the history of film. It's self-aware, transgressive, and a turning point in cinema as a medium that was beginning to reflect on where it's come from and where it may be heading. Los Olvidados by Luis Buñuel. In a career most known for his surrealist brand of cinema, it's interesting that one of his most essential works is also his most grounded. Los Olvidados is set in the slums of Mexico, following a group of neglected youths with uncertain futures. Yet although it remains a much more gritty, realist film in his repertoire, there are still salient moments in which Buñuel permeates the film with dreamlike filmmaking, intrusive techniques that take the audience completely by surprise. A shot where a character throws an egg and it splatters right on the lens of the camera. Even as a realist film, there's still nothing to say that one's unbridled creativity shouldn't be on show. Los Olvidados is a film wherein the auteur, even when outside of his own language, makes his presence known. A touchingly beautiful film and powerfully inventive. Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa. Rashomon was Kurosawa's first masterpiece, and its influence is only equalled by the likes of films such as Citizen Kane. Set in feudal Japan, a murder has occurred in the woods, and we hear multiple varied perspectives of the same event one after the other. It's a structural milestone, as within the space of a few years, cinema had developed from intolerance's thematic connections to this new esoteric brand of non-linear storytelling. The film is set in but a few locations, and yet Kurosawa manages to get the absolute most from all of them. Whereas The Last Laugh really freed the camera from the standard cinematic restraints, Rashomon proceeded to take it further. With a new method of handheld shooting, Kurosawa was able to track along with his characters through the forest, shooting directly at the sun, following characters as they sprint, all the while intercutting between the four depictions of the same event, the telling of the story, and the telling of the telling of the story. Rashomon is nothing short of the work of a master who has perfected his craft. This is filmmaking. Singing in the Rain by Gene Kelly and Stanley Donen. It's probably the most important musical of all time, and for good reason. Not only is the choreography and level of dancing almost unparalleled, it too is a commentary on the nature of musicals in an evolving Hollywood. We could see around this time how breaking the fourth wall was not enough to make people aware of their role as a spectator. Cinema was, by the 1950s, conceptually breaking down its genres and expectations, all the while remaining in a classical framework of cinema. And Singing in the Rain is exactly that. Old school Hollywood style production, as well as an avant-garde take on numbers, as we shift into the new golden age of the form. The climactic performance and dance number being the highlight of the entire piece. Tokyo Story by Yasujiro Ozu. Ozu as a filmmaker is identifiable by any of his shots from any of his films. He had a methodology, and he retained it throughout his entire filmography. His tatami shot of placing the camera at a low level, matching the eye line of one inside a Japanese household, is the lens of which we view his work. We are simultaneous spectators, while at the same time placed at this incredibly intimate vantage point, addressed directly through this poignant family drama. Following the strained relationship between an aging Japanese couple and their children, Tokyo Story is the most human of perhaps any film that's ever been created. There's a deep emotional resonance that oozes from this film as Ozu shoots everything with such a fleeting impermanence. He chooses what to show us by leaving out major portions of the narrative, as much of life is. Sometimes it's here with us, and then it's not. It's a film that operates on pure human emotion. It's completely unfiltered from this masterful lens that he possesses. The camera, the editing, everything feels as though it's there to service the overwhelming bittersweetness that is the human condition. It's beautiful, and there's nothing more that could describe it. Ugetsu by Kenji Mizoguchi. Mizoguchi was the other half to Kurosawa's period dramas, though Mizoguchi employed a far more ethereal quality to cinema in contrast to Kurosawa's bombastic style. Ugetsu brings a style of cinema that employs a constantly moving camera through mist-filled landscapes. Realism is mixed with the ghostly, and the atmosphere of dreams, nightmares, and reality merge in this transcendental exploration of human desire and spiritual longing. Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock. The first Alfred Hitchcock film on the list is an example of the filmmaker's constant need to innovate through visual language. For Hitchcock, the term language is necessary because his developments in cinema as a form of communication is second to none. He's the master of cinematic technique because his employment of all techniques displayed nothing more than absolute mastery. In Rear Window, he completely changes the idea of POVs in film, putting us directly in the shoes of our protagonist. All information is equally siphoned through Jeff and ourselves in exactly the same manner. We can only see as far as he can see. We can only hear as much as he can hear. Using the windows of a building as frames within frames, and the lens of a literal camera as a device to zoom is a genius form of storytelling. A brilliant way to examine how information is delivered to an audience and how tension is amplified through the language of cinema. The Night of the Hunter by Charles Laughton. The Night of the Hunter is a film like no other. As a genre, it's part thriller, part horror, part noir, part drama. Its art direction is a mixture of American Gothic and German Expressionism. Its atmosphere drifts. In one part, we float down the river in some ethereal nightmare, and in others, it's an ode to the resilience of children. The interesting part about Night of the Hunter is that our protagonists are children, and as a result, the threat of Harry Powell, played by Robert Mitchum, is approached with the almost simplistic imagery of a child. He's a haunting silhouette, he's an innate threat, and his presence is always felt. Mitchum's portrayal of a murderous preacher is one of the most haunting renditions of villainy to ever grace the screen, and Laughton's originality produced a film which is of a complete unique vision. Odette by Carl Theodor Dreyer. Here, minimalism is the key draw of Odette. Dreyer's use of sparse set design, long interrupted takes of slowly swaying cameras, and an austere manner of framing display the existential struggles that occur in one's faith. The film is patient, it's quiet, it's subdued, and much like his Passion of Joan of Arc, Dreyer tests himself as a filmmaker to remove all the excess and leave us with a profound meditation on the nature of humanity. Patha Panchali by Satyajit Ray. The first part of his Apu trilogy, Patha Panchali is an ode to rural India through the eyes of a young boy. The film follows the simple living of village life, and yet is shot in such a beautiful fashion. The landscapes in this film appear so unique. Its black and white cinematography I can't really have any good comparison with. There's something about the look of this film that I think is so different to anything else I've seen, and the beauty of the landscape is reflected in its incredibly empathic perspective that Rei lends to the rest of his characters. Seven Samurai by Akira Kurosawa. The world of action cinema must in some manner be traced back to Seven Samurai. What Kurosawa did for the action epic here was all but create it. Seven Samurai is to experience the genesis of what we would think of as action cinema, and Kurosawa was a master at the dynamism that comes with it. When we think of mise-en-scène, we think of all the elements within the frame individually that create the whole, and Kurosawa simply understood the necessity of making them all visible. Rain cascades from the sky, and wind blows through the leaves. The camera pans quickly as people run. He establishes through perfect framing and spatial awareness exactly where we are during a hectic scene, as to never become disorientated by the chaos that's occurring. That is what Kurosawa was able to do, control the chaos for his benefit. His direction was always superb, of capturing the intensity of extreme action, and yet there was always the rich character development of his troupe, which is what the entirety of the film hinges on. Many films can do one, but not the other, and Kurosawa mastered both, and did it as a visionary with no contemporaries to match his dexterity in either. The filmmaking was to inspire countless films and transform the very landscape of cinema as we know it. The Searchers by John Ford. If Stagecoach legitimized the American Western, then The Searchers perfected it. Everything that made John Ford a master is on display here, and perhaps at his best. Known for his grand staging, every gathering of people is composed with such precision, only matched by his compositions of Monument Valley. The character of Ethan, played by John Wayne, is the richest that he crafted, and his journey mirrors that of a great Greek tragedy. It's a feat of technicolor, and the vivid colours offer a warmth to this world that's being slowly forgotten. John Ford not only mythologizes the heroes of the Old West, but also humanizes them to put their flaws on display. Not enough people discuss the nuance in the characterization of the Searchers, and that's most likely because of its other successors, which was to become the benchmark absolute for the remainder of the cinematic Western. A Man Escaped by Robert Bresson. Rear Window taught us how POV and perspective can be tools to pass information and tension to the viewer. A Man Escaped displays how singular actions can progress any narrative. Set in a POW camp, A Man Escaped follows an inmate attempting to escape his prison. The prisoner has no one to speak to, and so most of the film is told with little dialogue, instead focusing on his actions, on his interactions with objects, on the slow markers of progress of the man's journey to freedom. Every movement becomes vital. The human body becomes a new language code as we begin to look for new things. How far has he ground a hole in the wall? How loud are the encroaching footsteps coming? All of Bresson's work is characterized by an almost mechanical approach to human interaction, but A Man Escaped shows how any action can hold weight in a person's story. The Cranes Are Flying by Mikhail Kalatozov. Ironically, though directed by Mikhail Kalatozov, The Cranes Are Flying is most recognized for its work by cinematographer Sergei Uruzevsky. For me, this is the first film where I see the auteur fully emerging in the realm of a cinematographer. There's an expressionism in the way the story is told, particularly through a storm sequence, where flashes of lightning illuminate a destroyed room. There's an emotional intensity throughout the film that's only surpassed by the incredible cinematography. It's a kind of camera work that would later inspire artists such as Emmanuel Lubetsky. Touch of Evil by Orson Welles. Celebrated for its incredible opening tracking shot, Touch of Evil is so much more. Coming as for what I would consider the finale for legitimate film noir, and not the neo-noir that would follow in films like Chinatown, Touch of Evil is the darkest portrayal of humanity within the noir genre. unafraid to delve into the depth of human corruption and show with an unflinching nature the crimes that human beings are able to commit. Touch of Evil carries a mise-en-scène where camera work, sound, acting and dialogue all match one another perfectly, brought together in another tour de force by Wells himself. Vertigo by Alfred Hitchcock. What was the first film in Sight and Sound's decennial list to topple Citizen Kane as the greatest film, Vertigo is Hitchcock's most complex and nuanced work. Following a mystery around a supposed dead woman, we're thrown into the spiralling psychology of a man falling in love, a murder mystery, and a fear of heights. Technically, Vertigo might fit into the cinematic lexicon as the film that popularised the dolly zoom, which again is Hitchcock being the endless innovator he was. However, it's so much more. The film also features animation, vivid and surreal colour schemes that play as motifs for the film, storytelling through silhouettes and forms of the human body, and layers upon layers of symbolism. There's so much to untangle in Vertigo that with every watch it just becomes a better and richer experience. Vertigo delves into a disorientation of dream sequences and the fragmentation that occurs with fantasy and the bringing of that fantasy to reality. From a narrative perspective, it's incredibly mature and sophisticated. But beyond that, it was just as much a milestone for cinematic storytelling across the board. Every avenue where innovation could occur did so in Vertigo. It truly deserves its reputation as arguably the greatest film of all time. The 400 Blows by François Truffaut. Although not technically the first film of the French New Wave, this would be the film to popularise the movement internationally and what I believe to be its pinnacle. The French New Wave can often be viewed as the bridging point between classic and modern cinema. Whereas throughout the 1950s, conceptually, films were beginning to lean more towards themes and narratives that deconstructed older models, the French New Wave pushed it that little bit further, and also integrated that within the very fabric of its cinematic language. With a playfulness, Truffaut moves through the streets of Paris with our protagonist Antoine in an almost plotless story about the turbulence of adolescence. We shoot on the streets of Paris as the actors interact with real people. Freeze frames and intrusive directing styles add a vibrancy to the filmmaking that was not seen through cinema before. Although La Bonne Cour is often pointed towards as the first New Wave film, it is the 400 Blows that really established its identity, taking elements of Italian neorealism and infusing it with the youthful energy of a new and exciting world. Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. A completely revolutionary left turn in the field of thriller. What Psycho did for editing comes only second to what it did for Fear of Showers, a sequence so infamous that people who have never seen it know exactly how the scene plays out. But what isn't spoke of with such reverence is everything beyond the shower sequence, and what that entails is a sheer powerhouse in suspense. Hitchcock's use of close-ups, of silence, of audience misdirection. This film is still astounding. The craftsmanship in guiding the viewer through this crescendo of tension is a sight to behold. It's such a detour from what was established in Vertigo that it just cements the absolute versatility of Hitchcock as a master filmmaker. La Ventura by Michelangelo Antonioni. A filmmaker who explores almost exclusively the barren landscapes of the human soul, La Ventura, in my estimation, is Antonioni's peak. After a woman mysteriously vanishes on an island trip with friends, existential despair begins to take over, and the remainders of the party have their lives completely unravelled, although not in any dramatic sense, but one that finds them blissfully wandering. The film slows down, and we soon realise that there will be no resolution to this mystery, and as such, no resolution to this sudden emergence in one's mind of the possibilities of what one's life may have been, and yet what it may still become. L'Avventura is ambiguous, it's dreamlike, it's spacious, and plot structure is abandoned for the purest of obscure atmospheres. Lawrence of Arabia by David Lean. Often I'm inclined to believe that Lawrence of Arabia is in fact the definitive epic in cinema. When you think of sprawling vistas, 70mm wide shots, you inevitably think of Peter O'Toole wandering the desert lands. The spectacle that's on show here is in many ways what we want all film to be. We want it to be larger than life, we want the music to be loud and swelling, and we want to be taken on a swashbuckling adventure with a protagonist who swallows up all the frame. And in every aspect, Lawrence of Arabia delivers. It has the greatest jump cut in history, second only to one I will mention shortly, and is a quintessential film when examining how to construct a film with seemingly infinite moving parts. It set a standard between the balance of spectacle and character study. La Jetée by Chris Marker. The final short film to appear on this watch list, Chris Marker decided to create a film completely outside of the realm of what defines a film. Rather than moving pictures, La Jetée is a sci-fi narrative told entirely through still photography. Its haunting voiceover and experimental structure displays just how the medium of cinema is still completely open to any unconventional form and is still able to translate deep human emotions of love and trauma through static images. Vive sa vie by Jean-Luc Godard. Although Breathless is seen as his most seminal piece, I believe the work that had the larger impact on the entirety of cinema was in fact Vive sa vie. Set in chapters through a fragmented narrative, Godard tells the story of a sex worker, although the traditional narrative is eschewed to focus more on the inner struggles of his protagonist. The film has a multitude of experimental filmic techniques, but rather than Breathless, where they do come across as experiments, here they feel directly implicated in the story that's being told. A conversation occurs between two increasingly distant people, and thus the camera just shows the back of their heads. A gunshot is replicated through various jump cuts in a single pan of the camera. The techniques that the French New Wave would become known for are far better implicated here than in any other of Godard's works. There's a Brechtian detached style at play which is far more seminal, and its remnants are more visible on the cinema that would come to follow. 8½ by Federico Fellini. The greatest fictional film about filmmaking, 8½ is a necessary film about what happens when film becomes so referential that the artist inserts his process and a fictionalized version of himself, and his memories and his flaws and his doubt and everything that he is in the film. The result just happens to be a masterpiece. However, this would have been a tenuous line for most. The film is simply that, and perhaps it's greater understood when examined in the context of the remainder of Fellini's work. I always recommend watching his work chronologically. However, if necessary, one can also watch La Strada to understand the development of this style. It's a mad world by Stanley Kramer. Although his greatest film is Judgment at Nuremberg, I would find it dismissive if in making a watch list that expounds on the possibilities of what film can achieve, if a giant, almost 4-hour spectacle of slapstick, absurdist comedy was not referenced on the list. A group of strangers are seeking a hidden fortune, and what follows is utter nonsense on a scale that's just ridiculous, and the film knows it. Characters mug at the camera. The crew's lives look as though they're in serious jeopardy in the making of the film, but there's something to be said for this unbridled ambition for a collection of stupid, yet incredibly expensive jokes. The Umbrellas of Cherbourg by Jacques Demy. Rather than following the traditional structure of a musical, with set musical numbers, everything in The Umbrellas of Cherbourg is sung. Every piece of dialogue is part of a grand musical set piece, with bold, saturated colour palettes strewn across the screen. The film is as romantic as it is melancholic, and much like Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast, one must be willing to approach the film with an openness, that for a brief moment, life can be viewed in this poetic, operatic quality. Woman in the Dunes by Hiroshi Teshigahara. The claustrophobic cinematography of Woman in the Dunes reflects the nature of a film about confinement. Psychological horror has always pushed the boundaries in cinema, and here we see another breakthrough. Teshigahara's haunting tale of a woman in whose existence is to be entrapped and shovel sand. The story is both allegorical, and yet the depth of exposing one's psychology through poetic imagery is a testament to behold. A truly powerful piece. Persona by Ingmar Bergman. Few films are explicitly designed with their art form in mind, but I'd wager that Persona is the film that comes closest to a representative of pure cinema. The fact is that this story simply can't be told in any other medium than the cinematic. The story of the identity of two women becoming inexplicably intertwined with one another is told through the fragmented visuals, the staging between the two, the symmetry of their poses, the repetition of the editing, even culminating in the very fracturing of the film itself. The power of the face is on full display in this film, and not only is it a piece of art in regards to cinematic language, it's a conceptual marvel the likes of which few art pieces could claim to be. Every watch results in new ideas and questions being formed. Persona is an infinite film. There is no beginning and no end to it, and it is what every film should strive to achieve: pure cinematic storytelling. The Battle of Algiers by Gillo Pontecorvo. Adopting a documentary style to depict Algeria's fight for independence, the Battle of Algiers is a stark, raw portrayal of urban warfare. Few films from this era look as contemporary as this film, and it becomes so authentic that you struggle to see where the film ends and where reality begins. The grainy black and white filming and dynamic editing between both rebels and the military offer a kinetic energy that the film uses constantly to keep you invested in the violence that surrounds these streets. It's immersive, but more than that, it shows a respect for the topics and themes that it's discussing. Andrei Rublev by Andrei Tarkovsky. Tarkovsky's second film would be the moment he began to cement his transcendental style in this retelling of the eponymous Russian medieval icon painter. His long tracking shots, his disjointed narrative, his observation of the serenity of nature. There's a style present here which is unlike any other filmmaker of the period. To explain his films is to merely describe them as spiritual or contemplative. However, to watch them is to understand them completely. There's no atmosphere like that of a Tarkovsky film. It's as though he's bottled the air from an ancient time and allowed it to roam free in his celluloid frames. It's indescribable what he embodies in this work. Playtime by Jacques Tati. A satire on modernity, Jacques Tati utilises incredible staging and his expertise of miming to observe the chaos of modern living and urban alienation through the lens of an expertly crafted comedy. With only a handful of sequences, Tati gets as much as he possibly can from every scenario, in both absurdity and poignancy. It's an ode to an even more classical style of cinema that displays a universality of the human experience and what we recognise as absurd. 2001: A Space Odyssey by Stanley Kubrick. There isn't much to be said about this film that hasn't already been said. A film that was as impactful on the arts as the space race was to humanity. The special effects that were pioneered in 2001 look as spectacular now as they did in 1968. Stanley Kubrick tells a story that begins at the dawn of man, through a newly imagined future, and beyond the boundaries of space and time into humanity's evolution. There is an experiential quality to the film where image is given a new meaning. The infamous Stargate sequence seems as though Kubrick is channeling a new language of cinema, one which slowly reveals itself over the period of one's exposure to it, almost like a transcendent Ludovico technique. The cosmic level of horror is frightening, while the spectacle of space is shot with an operatic beauty. The film has left an indelible mark on science fiction, cinema, and the world of art as a whole. And this was the film, by the way, that actually has the greatest jump cut in history. Kes by Ken Loach. The seminal film of the British kitchen sink realist movement, set in the north of England, we follow a young boy who's trapped in a working class family with a callous brother in an unjust school. And despite these circumstances, he finds a young kestrel and teaches it how to fly. Not only does this film excel at its level of realism through its use of setting and non-professional actors, but with it, it hits a level of truth about the hardship and the struggles for humanity to shine through, to be resilient in such hard times. The film is raw, and there's a poignancy throughout about viewing an unfair world through the eyes of a child. At some point, innocence must be lost, but what Ken Loach does here with his brand of empathic storytelling is a truly human tale. Once Upon a Time in the West by Sergio Leone. Sergio Leone was most known for his spaghetti westerns, the brand of westerns that didn't follow the archetype of what Hollywood was making, and proceeded to demythologize the heroic West to something more sinister. As we've seen the developments in styles over time, by the end of the 1960s, cinema had fully embraced the roles that began to emerge in film noir of the darkness of humanity. However, in Once Upon a Time in the West, Leone gives us a cinematic opera in which these characters parlay. Every shot is an expansive widescreen. Leone's eye for composition makes every character and every silhouette appear as though they were pinched out to be placed in this painterly fashion. The music by Ennio Morricone is unlike anything you've heard before. This is the peak of filmmaking technique when it comes to the Western genre, particularly in this new transgressive form. The Colour of Pomegranates by Sergei Parajanov. So I'm aware that there's a joke, that whenever we make a piece, the colour of pomegranates always manages to show up. I get it, but it's probably because it's a brand of filmmaking that more people should familiarise themselves with. I mean, the film is pure image, not even necessarily the interplay of images, just how through art direction and composition, one can craft a visual poem. If you want to see how images can be framed in order to transcend traditional cinematic language, then this is that film. It's perhaps the closest comparison we have in cinema to the world of painting. Army of Shadows by Jean-Pierre Melville. There are films that clearly influence films that follow, but I don't think I've seen a film with more influence and less appreciation than Army of Shadows. This film set the standard for the modern thriller, bar none. If you enjoy the works of David Fincher or the early work of Denis Villeneuve, then you have this film to thank. Set in the French Resistance, Army of Shadows creates this world of paranoia and tension. The sky is grey, and the film's colour is muted and subdued. We feel as though we're in a dark and dangerous world. Scenes are permeated with silence, and the film is constantly brewing with this suspense that characters may betray one another, or that they may be found out. There's a clinical eye from Melville, which makes the evil of this world feel all the more sinister. It's a work of such influential vision that if it came out today, no one would question it. It's that good. The Conformist by Bernardo Bertolucci. Set in fascist Italy, The Conformist follows a deeply flawed protagonist who devises conformity in a world of social unease. A rich mise-en-scène follows this intensely bleak world of a man who is simply seeking acceptance, even if it's from those who commit evil. A thorough and erudite character study paired with filmmaking of the highest order. A Touch of Zen by King Hu. The beginning of the martial arts film as we know it, particularly the wuxia genre, which deals with historical fantasy in China. What King Hu did here for action choreography was unleash it, making it utterly free. His inventive wire work allowed his actors to fly across the screen. The choreography was always at the forefront, shooting in long takes as to not disturb the flow of action. He uses the space of his surroundings, including the empty space, to create this almost spiritual transcendence of the form. Again, In the journey of cinema, martial arts films ultimately begin here. As such, does the potential for most action cinema. The Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 by Francis Ford Coppola. These are my personal favourite films of all time because they epitomise everything that a film wants to be. It wants to be deeply philosophical as well as incredibly accessible. It wants to be perceived as high art as well as a piece of entertainment. And The Godfather does it all. Perfect in every department. The warm lighting in darkened rooms, the pacing which always keeps the narrative moving, yet gives space for reflection and characters to ponder. We see the thought process of our characters as they interplay from one another, and all within the framework of an epic family drama. Whatever you're seeking to learn more from in a film, you'll be able to find it in these. There's nothing that it can't offer you. Gordon Willis's cinematography, Mario Puzo's screenplay, Nina Rota's score, everything absolutely perfect. Pink Flamingos by John Waters. And segueing from The Godfather, we reach the most disgusting piece of trash ever made, and I love it. Pink Flamingos is a shocking, perverted, vile piece of cinema that follows its main character Divine, whose ambition is to be crowned the filthiest person alive. What follows is an unapologetic rollercoaster of cinematic taboos. John Waters' sense of aesthetic is everything that shouldn't be, but his campy sense of humour and low-budget visuals place the film in a realm where it clearly is exactly what it wants to be. So if you want to see people commit the most degenerate acts imaginable, all for the sake of making something unconventional, then I highly recommend this film. Because the best part about Pink Flamingos is that it's not trying to be anything it's not. If anything, it's not even trying at all. But if you really want to know how far cinema has really fallen and how fearful we are of creating work that's groundbreaking, just remember that this film was released in theatres the same week as The Godfather. The Spirit of the Beehive by Victor Erice. Only making a handful of films, Victor Erice still managed to craft a language so delicate, depicting a young girl's fascination with death. Shot in Franco's Spain, The Spirit of the Beehive feels like a whisper. It feels so fragile. It weaves together a child's imagination with the macabre elements of society. It's poetic and sensitive, and is spurred on by perhaps the most triumphant performance of any child in any film. It's beautiful and ethereal, and when I think of the images that this film conjures, it really can't be described what kind of mood that it evokes. I think of a child attracted to the most sinister parts of the world, and the inevitability of one's loss of innocence, and yet find the whole thing comforting. It really is a beautiful perspective. The Exorcist by William Friedkin. Speaking of beautiful perspective, never has a mainstream horror release had such a global impact as The Exorcist did. The film pushed the boundaries for what horror films could achieve, further breaking taboos by blending both a realist, gritty aesthetic with supernatural horror. People often get caught up in the shocking elements of the film and forget just how successful The Exorcist works as a standalone piece of cinema. La Maman et la Putain by Jean Eustache. By the 1970s, the French New Wave had been and gone, and what follows in the arts is an era of disillusionment. Whereas the New Wave opened up the possibilities of film with essentially limitless potential, what followed were those that were liberated by this potential, only to find that with infinite freedoms came instability, and an infinite number of avenues that can also lead to disappointment. There's an ennui that becomes exposed throughout the late 60s and 70s in cinema, and perhaps this is best exemplified by the arduous La Maman et la Putain. At over 3 hours in length, following the dissatisfaction in a love triangle, Eustache shoots in a completely unflattering manner. Not focusing on framing, keeping the dialogue natural, it's realism for the sake of illuminating the complexities of a new existential youth. The characters don't know where they're heading, they don't even ultimately know what they want, and the entire film aims to translate the hopelessness and pointlessness of it all. It's not an easy watch, nor an enjoyable watch, but I'm inclined to consider it a necessary watch. Badlands by Terrence Malick. Terrence Malick began his foray into his brand of naturalistic cinematography, his lyrical narrations, the blurring of innocence with violence, all in his first feature. The film is a meditation again on the lost youth of America, pursuing its romantic ideals, all while in the observant eye of nature. His films are like a dream, and his imagery possesses endless poetry. He's a director with a keenly spiritual eye. The Conversation by Francis Ford Coppola. Not since M has a film so vitally relied on sound. If you want to see how sound design can create a landscape of psychological suspense, then look no further than this film. Gene Hackman plays a surveillance expert who stumbles upon a murder mystery through his audio tapes. The mystery then unfolds for us exclusively through audio. We too have to keep our ears pricked up to hear any new details. Throughout the film, sounds can be given new contexts. It's a wonderful foray into the often neglected but equally necessary audible storytelling fragment of cinema. A Woman Under the Influence by John Cassavetes. Whereas Kes typified the British kitchen sink drama, A Woman Under the Influence formed the foundation for American realist drama. Following a story of a wife and mother undergoing mental difficulties, Cassavetes employs an improvisational milieu for his actors to work in. Very long takes, most scenes consisting of character interactions with less semblance of a plot. For Cassavetes, narrative is far less important than the often spontaneous shifts and outbursts of human emotion. His characters are incredibly real, and the emotions feel real. There's no morality in his films because it's a portrait of people just living their lives with struggle, hatred, and love and need and responsibility as they all coexist. And the result is an incredibly poignant portrayal of marriage and unconditional love between two people. The main duo of Peter Falk and Gena Rowlands is perfect, with Gena Rowlands being the only other performance to rival Gloria Swanson's as the greatest performance by any actress. Jean Diamant, 23 Quai de Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles by Chantal Akerman. Jean Diamant is a different brand of cinema. It has more in common with a conceptual contemporary art piece than it does with cinema. The watching of the film is dealt with in a real-life pacing, which means that there are segments of minutes at a time in which our main character is cleaning a room, or making a bed, or peeling potatoes. We're meant to feel the monotony of this woman's life and how ordinary behaviour becomes transformed into an exploration of a constrained existence. When normal action becomes isolated, it becomes something conceptual. It's a way to make the invisible visible. Jean Diamant opens a perspective for people that it's a realisation of what cinema can also be, and in my opinion, it's one of the most successful attempts at a film translating a singular concept through a realm of video art. Again, when it works, cinema still has the capacity to be anything. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom by Pier Paolo Pasolini. Salo has garnered a reputation as the most disturbing film ever made, and while I understand that perception, it also negates much of the artistry that the film possesses. The film is undeniably brutal, however to use such extreme imagery in order to critique authoritarian powers results in a film that's deeply philosophical and political on a scale that no other film is. Its extremity can't be ignored, and I'm certain that this is the main reason that most people become exposed to the film. However, the film requires a deep engagement on behalf of the viewer. This is not a gratuitous violence that does injustice to the realities of oppressive violence. This is a deeply complex and uncomfortable portrayal of sadism. The film opens with a bibliography for further reading to understand the film's thematics, and that alone is something that demonstrates the depth that this film has, encouraging the viewer to analyse it from more of a literary perspective. It may be a controversial film, however nothing can take away from its rich brand of intense storytelling. Nashville by Robert Altman. This is a film which has its own vitality. Following an ensemble cast that go and do their own thing, Altman crafts a film where narratives overlap, where satire crosses into media and politics, where the entirety of American culture is on display. This is a film that plays fast and loose as we move in between everything and everyone, as each has brief moments of becoming the temporary main subject to the film. A completely unique mood piece and an exemplary slice of life style of filmmaking. Jaws by Steven Spielberg. It's hard to believe that the Hollywood blockbuster emerged so late in the timeline of cinema. It's perhaps even harder to envision that what would instigate this brand of filmmaking would be a film about a shark. But what Spielberg did was take the audience's desire for monster movies of the 1950s Hammer variety and create something contemporary. Fear and anticipation is the highlight of Jaws. A traditional thriller is elevated by us never seeing the obvious threat which we know exists. We see its POV. We hear the musical motif associated with its close proximity, all before we see the beast itself. Spielberg is an expert in directing large spaces with crowds of people, and it only heightens the suspense of knowing that some disaster is about to occur. The subjective camera allowing us to only see what our protagonist sees, constantly hindering our view of the whole picture, is a masterclass of Spielberg's directing after clearly having graduated from the works of Hitchcock. Barry Lyndon by Stanley Kubrick. Authenticity of 18th century France has never been so spectacular, with compositions inspired by master painters of the era, using only natural lighting and candlelit scenes that required specialist lenses to be manufactured for the film. Kubrick's painterly images are strewn across the entirety of Barry Lyndon to create nothing short of a visual masterpiece. Cinema has never looked so sophisticated. Taxi Driver by Martin Scorsese. The peak of American cinema was in the 1970s. After its artist had experienced years of exposure to European cinema of the previous decades, the nuanced level of filmmaking was a clear influence. And at the zenith of this new golden age of the United States sits Taxi Driver, a deeply violent film about outcast Travis Bickle and his insatiable urge to morph the world into one wherein he may finally invoke some power. The film is hauntingly existential, with Scorsese's ability to both beautify the streets of New York as well as plunge us into its horrifying depths. The nighttime photography of this film is beautiful, as rain-soaked roads reflect the neon lights of gritty urban decay. All the while, the wandering eyes of Travis are picked up by the ethereal camera work of a master filmmaker at his very best, with Bernard Herrmann guiding us along with a romantic brass ensemble and Paul Schrader penning an uncomfortably recognisable loner. It's one of the great character studies elevated to being one of the great pieces of its medium. Eraserhead by David Lynch. Made over the course of many years, David Lynch's feature is a celebration of individual vision. A film examining body horror, surrealist narratives, stark black and white cinematography, and developing its own form of logic, Eraserhead is its own beast, and I can't admire it enough for its brazenly independent artistry. Lynch here established something true to him. In one moment it evokes surrealist comedy before transforming into a horrific nightmare. His use of audio is criminally underrated at evoking this sense of anxiety, that something unintelligible lies in these shadows. A world that isn't quite organic, but isn't quite mechanical. It's a world that only exists in a vacuum of its own dialectics, and yet it makes perfect sense. It's a film where thematics emerge through mood and atmosphere, where the intellectual takes a backseat. Eraserhead demands respect in the history of cinema that there will always be a space for complete originality. Star Wars by George Lucas. After all is said and done, Star Wars will be the film on this list more than any other that will be remembered. It was a new kind of blockbuster, but one that emerged from a classic brand of filmmaking. Its biggest influences come from many of the filmmakers we've mentioned, notably Kurosawa and Ford, and it shows. It's a classic hero's journey that's hard to appreciate now just because of how much of a blueprint it ended up becoming. However, that's one of the benefits of looking at cinema chronologically. You understand the background to which a piece was released and realise that there was nothing close to this brand of cinema. Science fiction at this point was either cold and technical or camp and schlocky. Star Wars brought newer genres into the forefront of mainstream appeal and could only do so with the strong artistic vision of a crew that wanted to make something special and something new. It became the cultural phenomenon which we all know today, and in many ways, it was deserving of it. House by Nobuhiko Obayashi. A playful funhouse of a film, House utilizes fourth wall breaking editing and a kaleidoscope of colours and surreal effects to create one of the most unconventional films to date. It's a haunted house film that never takes itself seriously and yet maintains such a distinct character so unique to itself. It's a joy to watch because it's a film where you never know what's coming next. Alien by Ridley Scott. An absolute triumph for set design and art direction, the use of practical effects, lighting and sound design craft a cosmic, claustrophobic experience unlike any other. The low-tech aesthetic of the film was a revolution in the sci-fi space, transforming the tropes of the distant future with a gritty, more realist approach. Operators of spacecraft were now essentially no different than blue-collar workers. All the while, the mystery of this other world is built in the fragmented lore of a crashed spaceship and creatures with an entire gestation phase. This is how world building should be done in film. Enough information to intrigue us, and enough mystery to frighten us. Genre work of the 1970s had breached beyond their typical tropes to form new fusions with other genres and still exist within a classical filmmaking framework. Alien was the forerunner for this perspective of blurring genres and still having them serve foremost as genre films. And let's not forget that Alien also possesses probably the greatest character design in the history of monsters. Apocalypse Now by Francis Ford Coppola. Based on Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Apocalypse Now follows a boat drifting down a river during the Vietnam War to put an end to a US colonel gone AWOL. As the crew drift further down the river, a dehumanization and disassociation begins to occur as the film fades into a haze of violent, dreamlike imagery. The film juxtaposes the scenic landscape of the jungle with the macabre nature of the Vietnam War. A golden hour sunset is contrasted with the killing of civilians, and all throughout the film, the motifs of coloured flares, of searchlights, of fire, paint a landscape that grows more and more inhuman. The film is incredibly expressionistic thanks to the work of cinematographer Vittorio Storaro, whose expertise in colour really added to this film. From the very opening, Coppola manages to portray visually the horrors of war through a shattered psyche. It's one of the greatest directed films of all time that displays a precise vision of an arc of a journey from beginning to end. Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky. A dream in the form of a film, Stalker follows a group of men traversing an area simply called the Zone, in their quest to find a room that upon discovery will grant you a wish. The film moves slowly, as time itself becomes a salient part of the film. The camera tracks along the ground as our characters begin to dream. The sounds of nature and the elements echo through ancient corridors. Everything feels impermanent and incredibly important. This film is Tarkovsky's style at its most visible, completely transcendental and untied to anything of the material world. This is a form of filmmaking at its apex which few can replicate, though many can mimic. This is a film which communicates with the soul of humanity and is felt by all. This is more than filmmaking. Raging Bull by Martin Scorsese. A biopic of boxer Jake LaMotta, Scorsese delivers a tour de force of cinema, painting a portrait of an individual that balances both visceral realism with a poetic language. Jake LaMotta is a violent man, and yet his story is one that speaks to the humanity possessed by every individual. Conducting his story to classical music and setting his life out almost within chapters, Scorsese crafts vignettes of an individual as we witness their transformation in a raw exploration of the self-destructive nature of a powerfully masculine man. This is a true biopic showing that everyone has a story that, told in the right way, displays the complexity of the human condition that remains the cornerstone to any great art. The Shining by Stanley Kubrick. Rarely does a film this enigmatic achieve the sense of cult status as The Shining did. However, there's something about Kubrick's direction which people have found so captivating to this day. The Shining is, in simplified terms, a haunted house story, but Kubrick realises that any setting has the potential to evoke something greater than its surface, and his eye for set design and composition add to this unnerving quality that seeps from the walls of the Overlook Hotel. His impactful use of zooms throughout, the now iconic patterns used throughout the decor of the hotel, his symmetrical compositions, everything in The Shining is an exercise in ambiguous symbolism, and it can still remind us today that the messages in a film can emerge in the largest and smallest areas of the frame. Pichochi by Hector Babenco. In Brazil, the realist movement has been dominated over the decades by a singular film, Pichochi. Adopting a raw documentary style of realism, Pichochi is a stark portrayal of the story of street children in Brazil. However, what's most discussed about the film is the death of the real-life actor of the main character in similar circumstances to how the film portrayed the lives of these children, being killed by police at the age of 19. Films like Pichochi are difficult watches, as they confront viewers to address the real-world injustices that occur outside of the cinema screen, cinema and art alike being the mere vessel to get these messages across. Koyaanisqatsi by Godfrey Reggio. A story told in images and music, Koyaanisqatsi is a form of poetic documentary that uses the language of cinema to translate a message to a contemporary society. The genesis of this idea can be traced back to man with a movie camera, as messages are all well and good to be told to people, but there's something about witnessing the images of what you speak of, to see with your own eyes what's happening, to have a more transformative effect on any recipient. Koyaanisqatsi shoots with stellar cinematography, instances of living from all around the world, using time-lapses in megacities, rapid editing between variances in lifestyle, all conducted to a soundtrack by Philip Glass to portray a life that's out of balance. The whole film is an experiment in film language as a tool for individual awakening, and it's a powerful one at that. Videodrome by David Cronenberg. Combining body horror with unbelievable practical effects, Cronenberg explores the impact of media on a person's psychology by warping the physicality of the world that surrounds them and then warping their own body. The blurring line between the human body and technology creates a disturbing delve into the era of media obsession. Ran by Akira Kurosawa. Having already mentioned two films in which Kurosawa altered the very landscape of cinema, it was in Ran that his technique arguably reached its absolute peak, and his methodology was at its most visible. Using King Lear as a framework, Kurosawa utilizes elaborate color schemes to denote three dueling brothers and crafts an absurdly grandiose Japanese epic. The scale of war in these films is sheer spectacle, building giant sets that are burnt to the ground while an army of soldiers are composed to watch a mad king walk amongst its ashes. The imagery in this film is stunning, and Kurosawa conducts it all with such mastery. Many Kurosawa films display the same tenacity that he has for ostentatious and loud imagery, but Ran is the pinnacle of his filmmaking mastery. Come and See by Elem Klimov. Set in the Soviet Union during World War II, Come and See depicts the most gruesome and bleak depiction of war cinema has witnessed. The film immerses us in the shoes of a child wandering the countryside as his surrounding villages are invaded. The film uses complete subjectivity of its protagonist by putting the camera in a POV, having characters speak directly to the camera. The entire piece is nightmarish. Everything that our main character sees, we see, and the result is a haunting and devastating landscape of death. The film plunges us in the belly of this hellscape, and we're never given an ounce of breath, because the closest we can get to understanding the horrors of this war is to treat us as if we're there directly. There's no escape from this horribly claustrophobic experience of real-life misery. Tenshi no Tamago by Mamoru Oshii. A similar approach to The Colour of Pomegranates, Angel's Egg excels in using imagery as a form of unique symbolism. However, with more of a narrative at play here, what we witness is a masterful exploration of both animation and symbolic storytelling. Its structure is minimal, yet the story of a young girl carrying an egg through a gothic, dilapidated city evokes a richly meditative atmosphere. Louisa and I once curated a small film festival in which we were asked to select films that evoked curiosity. We picked works of Hitchcock and Bergman amongst others, yet Angel's Egg was the film that strangers and even people who were not well versed in cinema approached us to say that this was the film that had the biggest impact on them. It's an exploration of one's own spirituality, but manages to hit this magical spot where it communicates something otherworldly. A short film about killing by Krzysztof Kieślowski. An extension of one of his Decalogue episodes, a short film about killing displays Kieślowski's ability to develop individual languages for every one of his projects. Here, the tone of the film deals with murder and justice. It's a dark film, and so the cinematography is made of filters upon filters which darken the film and nearly destroy the image. Frames have areas completely blacked out. Colours are harsh with an almost bleach quality to them. The film is barely surviving through the cinematic techniques. All the while, the meditation on society's capacity for violence is dealt with in a beautifully tender and tragic manner. The film displays Kieślowski's terrific subjective lens. However, if you can, it would also be worth to watch the entirety of where this piece comes from and watch Decalogue. A City of Sadness by Ho Xiaoshen. A masterwork of restraint and patience that typifies Ho's style as well as the style that would come to permeate much of the Taiwanese New Wave. Post-World War II, the imprisonment of those from mainland China was an upheaval of a socio-political norm at the time, and Ho navigates this with a detached yet intimate style of directing. Shots rarely move, the sound is diegetic, everything is minimal, as life plays out in front of the camera, allowing the viewer to settle into every frame. The muted colour palette, the influence of Ozuian familial dramas, put the viewer in the perspective of a silent witness. This meditative style we saw emerge throughout the 40s and 50s now has a new face amongst a new generation of filmmakers. Again, trauma displayed not in the loud set pieces, but in the quiet, intimate moments that remind us of the often inescapable circumstances of one's political and personal life. The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover by Peter Greenaway. Peter Greenaway often proclaims cinema to be dead, and if he is wrong, then he's doing everything in his power to kill it. A style of cinema that more than any other could be called theatrical, The Cook, the Thief, His Wife and Her Lover is a hyper-stylized, gluttonous feast of excess. All shot from the perspective of a viewer in a theatre, the film uses theatrical lighting, colours that shift as characters wander from room to room. The film is artifice incarnate. Nothing about the film is real, and nothing is professing to be so. The drama is grotesque, and yet it's juxtaposed to some of the most beautiful music and beautiful costume design in cinema. The Cook, the Thief is everything that would put a person off film. No logic, seemingly no morals, yet the irony being that Greenaway has the ability to make all of this disgusting content into something beautiful. He may not want it to be cinema, but he is in fact making some of the best cinema there is. Tetsuo the Iron Man by Shinya Tsukamoto. Sharing much in common with Eraserhead, Tetsuo is a visceral dive into a black and white cyberpunk world where flesh and metal fuse in a chaotic vision. But rather than Lynch's work, Tetsuo is completely frenetic. Somewhere between Eraserhead and House, the film is chopped and cut up in a completely erratic fashion. As the handheld camera sweeps in and out, stop-motion animation is the method for our grotesque transformation to occur that further emphasises our main character's unnatural movements. The film is one about textures, as the discordance between iron and the human body clash with one another. Harsh lighting disorientates the viewer, confusing us as to what's real and what's artificial. By the end of the 1980s, a brand new independent style of filmmaking was emerging that was no longer confined to the B-movie campness of the 1970s. The means of movie making was increasing when more experimental explorations like Tetsuo could be achieved. Do the Right Thing by Spike Lee. Do the Right Thing is a story of a melting pot, where cultures and races clash and coexist with one another on one hot summer's day. The film has all the passion of a student film, but with the vision of one that's graduated from a school influenced by his masters, with references of classic American cinema as well as a frenetic experimental style of shooting. There's something as playful as there is urgent in Do the Right Thing, as Lee creates an authentic aura of a single day in Generation X America. Pop culture is a new currency. Life is more braggadocious, and the spirit of what has come before us can't be contained. The camera is a device that can capture all facets of life and does so by breaking the fourth wall, using every angle available in a neighbourhood that's ready to explode. Goodfellas by Martin Scorsese. What instigated a brand new era of dynamic filmmaking can be represented by Goodfellas. Inspiring an entire generation of up-and-coming filmmakers, Scorsese took his hybrid of classic and avant-garde filmmaking of Raging Bull and infused it with a hyperkinetic energy. Goodfellas is a film that's always on the move. Music from every era of the film's constantly moving chronology paint the scenes as characters rapidly bounce off of one another. Henry Hill's narration keeps the film moving at a frenetic pace, and the finale acts as a crescendo of all of the film's energy reaching its climax. The film is about a warped masculine lens, and yet Scorsese expertly crafts both the allure and mayhem of this glamorous and brutal lifestyle. It's cool and chaos all in one. Close Up by Abbas Kiarostami. It's difficult to place documentaries on a watch list because so much of their quality also comes down to fortuitous circumstances. However, Close Up is not that. Following a real story of a man that pretended to be his favourite film director on a whim to a stranger he encountered on a bus, Abbas Kiarostami later met up with the man and the family involved and told them to reenact the entire situation. Half of the film is that reenactment, while the other half is the real court case that ensued that was filmed by Kiarostami. Told through this meta-narrative, Kiarostami bypasses the sensationalism that such a story could cause and uses a minimalist style to allow the film's emotional resonance to emerge naturally. And through this perspective, the result is a lyrical and poetic depiction of an unsung hero of cinema. Not the director, but his subject, Hossein Sabzian. A Brighter Summer Day by Edward Yang. Edward Yang solidifies the Taiwanese New Wave style in the sprawling epic of disillusioned youths in 1960s Taiwan. The film is composed in wide static shots. A deep focus allows viewers to explore the entirety of the frame, with the environment and backgrounds becoming as integral to the piece as the characters in the front. Long takes and measured pacing immerse us in a world that moves slowly. Everything is subdued, and like all of Yang's films, they're constructed to evoke a nostalgia for a world you may be unfamiliar with, one that may even be fraught with tragedy and sadness, but there's something truthful about it all. The muted colour palette, people composed in incredibly intimate manners. The work of Edward Yang paved the way for the new grand family epic, an unparalleled study of the naturalistic landscape of a changing world and the fragility of the individuals that inhabit them. Man Bites Dog by Remy Belvaux, André Bonzel, and Benoit Poelvoorde. Using the medium of mockumentary to satirise our insatiable desire for media violence, Man Bites Dog follows a group of filmmakers following a serial killer on a murder spree, and before they know it, they become implicated in his crimes. There's an unfiltered level of brutality on display in the film, and all the film's violence is delivered as serious as it is comedic. The resulting tone of Man Bites Dog is one that's very enjoyable, all the while incredibly discomforting. The film questions viewer complicity to media sensationalism and the ethical responsibilities of an audience. Many pieces of art explore this avenue, but few do it with such bravery as Man Bites Dog. Hardboiled by John Woo, an over-the-top celebration of bullets and bloodshed in the most stylized action film to date, and setting the standard for contemporary high-octane action, as well as the identity for Hong Kong action movies. Woo mastered action choreography, making it an intricate set piece meticulously planned. Utilizing long tracking shots, the camera is a fluidly moving entity, while everything around us is complete carnage. And yet it's all done with incredible precision. Entire sets are destroyed as the debris from bullets make shrapnel into part of the mise-en-scène. Yet none of this would be possible if the staging and framing wasn't blocked perfectly. The image of Detective Tequila flying through the air in slow motion, dual-wielding guns as bullets fly around him, is John Woo's style encapsulated in a single image. And we should never dismiss the cool factor of art as being an elevating factor. Satan Tango by Bellatar. The first time I watched Satan Tango, I was a different person by the time I finished it. Upon its ending, I realised that this was a type of film that was possible. This was a kind of cinema I didn't know could exist. At over 7 hours in length, its sheer breadth cannot be ignored when speaking about Satan Tango. It is for many people the longest film they will ever watch, but this isn't without reason. Satan Tango is a film about stagnation. It's about the oppression of one's circumstances, all set in a desolate Hungarian community that seems completely separate from time. Shots linger for over minutes, transferring us as viewers into an almost hypnotic experience, with the film moving forward chronologically before moving back slightly, like a dance. The film is desolate, and its black and white cinematography is definitely more black than white. The film is a behemoth, both in the viewing experience, but also in its content. It's a heavy watch, and by the end, this oppressive landscape looks and feels as though it will go on forever. Satan Tango shows us a decaying village in the midst of the moralities of people decaying alongside it. You'll see a lot of difficult things in this film, but they're necessary for what is one of the greatest achievements in cinematic history. Pulp Fiction by Quentin Tarantino. A generation of filmmakers were born and bred on this film, and let's try not to alter the perception of its importance. Yes, it is perhaps the art film that gathered more attention than any other in history, but what it did for film structure, for film narrative, for the self-referential brand of filmmaking was completely revolutionary, and deservingly so. Tarantino was of the school of the French New Wave, where technique should bear the image of the filmmaker, of the auteur. But Tarantino took that a step further and created a collage piece of pop culture and of cinema itself, picking and choosing elements from his repertoire of a cinematic upbringing to craft his own anachronistic world. Blending genres, blending eras, and throwing his narrative into a blender resulted in a complete reinvention of the crime drama and cinema entire. Dialogue has never been the same since Pulp Fiction, and the equilibrium of contemporary filmmaking was shattered by this cultural touchstone. Though I still find it funny knowing that the average person has watched a film with a character and scene in it like Zed. Clerks by Kevin Smith. The 90s was the era in which independent cinema gained a new vitality. Strange and idiosyncratic ideas for films were no longer demoted to B-movie schlock and no-budget curiosities. The developments in video and film technology meant that guerrilla-style filmmakers were able to come up with passion projects and actually make a real-life film. Nothing embodies that like Clerks by Kevin Smith. Shot on black and white simply because it was cheaper, Clerks is a film about whatever the filmmaker wanted it to be about. This is a product of all those childhood conversations about if you could make a film, you would make it about this, and the characters would speak about all the things that you found cool, and you could make it crude and vulgar. That's all it is. A very funny, very authentic piece of art made by someone who sacrificed their time and effort to make it a reality. Anything can be a film, and any idea with as little technical backing can become a great film. The Lion King by the Walt Disney Company. We often look at live-action cinema to teach us about image literacy. However, oftentimes if we want to understand image, we must go to a more primal source. Painting can teach us far more about how to construct an image than most films can. An artist possesses more control. Though if we are to use cinema as a teaching tool, then the Disney Renaissance is a perfect example of beautiful image construction. And right in the middle of that incredible resurgence is their masterpiece, The Lion King. If you want to learn about colour theory, watch this film. You could even just watch the opening to learn everything about visual language and visual storytelling. It's an absolute visual triumph. La Haine by Matthew Kassovitz. Set in the Parisian banlieues, La Haine is a film with a momentous aesthetic. Shot in handheld yet deftly composed at the same time, everything about La Haine is unconventional and simultaneously formal. Frames are beautifully composed, even when it's done with a kind of ignorant bragging style, similar to how many of our characters conduct themselves. There's an effortless coolness in the honesty of what La Haine is. It's not afraid to be simultaneously high art while still being truthful to the street culture it wants to represent. And so you get this hybrid film that's completely original in all regards. What this film possesses is a great understanding of its environment, and when we move from the inner city slums to the centre of Paris, our characters have shifted from one world to another, and the film transforms along with it. Techniques that were present before seem as out of place of our characters. La Haine is fantastic. Cure by Kitoshu Kurosawa. A haunting and ambiguous exploration of the human psyche through a quiet and spacious aesthetic. There's a looming threat portrayed through psychological unease. Empty rooms and isolated figures amplify this unnervingly quiet and sinister film. Cure is a film about the capacity of human darkness and is designed in the entirety of its mise-en-scène to leave the audience with a lingering sense of dread, and it does so through a remarkably sparse aesthetic. Festen by Thomas Vinterberg. The Dogma 95 Principles was a manifesto created by both Thomas Vinterberg and Lars von Trier, which indicated that in order to be a Dogma film, a film had to use handheld cameras, could use no artificial light or sound, and a number of other almost anti-film rules. The movement was about providing a reset to cinema, to strip it to its barest of bones, where content and the rawness of human experience could be held at the forefront with nothing to dilute it. Festen is the first and best Dogma film, set at a wedding where a son reveals a harrowing secret that his family have been harbouring for years. Because of the aesthetic, there's a rawness that heightens the film's authenticity. Festen is a good reminder that even this late on in film's story, we can always return to the basics. Beau Travail by Claire Denis. Set amidst the camaraderie of the French Foreign Legion, Beau Travail is an exercise in the unspoken. Using empty landscapes, physical movement and sparse dialogue, Denis creates a world of a warped masculinity, where isolation makes space for meditation. All the emotions in this film are depicted through the human body. It possesses the same poetic physicality as Meshes of the Afternoon, but does so in a more clinical manner to critique its subjects. Ghost Dog, The Way of the Samurai by Jim Jarmusch. The definition of independent filmmaking, Jim Jarmusch takes the hitman and mafia genre films and turns them completely on their head. Forrest Whitaker plays a hitman who abides by a code of the samurai living in an industrial American city. The film takes itself completely seriously, all the while understanding the ridiculous nature of its setting. It's such a unique film because its approach to transgression of genre films is so sincere, but it's open-minded enough to show self-awareness of its own artifice. with a soundtrack produced by RZA and interspersed by read chapters of an actual samurai code, Ghost Dog is a wonderfully strange and completely unique film, and showed that by the 90s, cinema had truly reached a benchmark of limitless possibilities. The Matrix by the Wachowskis. A groundbreaking work of action cinema that relies entirely on the assuredness of its own aesthetic, using influence from Japanese fashion, from video games, from postmodern philosophy, all to create a singular contained vision. The Matrix works so well because of that vision. Everything works to service all of its moving parts, taking pre-existing cinematic techniques pioneered in the works of Seven Samurai and Hard Boiled, and skyrocketing them. Its use of slow motion was completely innovative with the bullet time technique. Innovative fight choreography and a cyberpunk aesthetic demonstrates the power of a well thought out and total vision for cinema. American Movie by Chris Smith. And the final film of the 20th century Watchlist is the documentary American Movie. Why? Because even after everything you learn about cinema, once you've gained all the knowledge and technique, you still have to go out and make the thing. And nothing embodies more the spirit of creation than the journey of Mark Borchardt and his passion project. Making a horror film on a shoestring budget, having his family come in to act for him, and the constant looming threat of creditors chasing him is something that any aspiring creative can relate to. But the film shows the resilience of creativity, because all we have to do is look through the history of cinema to see that it's made up of people that went against the grain, that went against adversity. All the films that we've mentioned here did something different. They opposed the standard and inadvertently created new ones. And that's the ethos of American Movie, that through determination and vision, we can see how passion for what you believe can be stronger than any system. And it's that spirit that keeps any art form alive.